Welcome to the China Desk Podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire, with your host, Steve Yates.
Welcome to the China Desk Podcast. I'm your host, Steve Yates, Senior Research Fellow for China and National Security at the Heritage Foundation. A reminder to our audience for whom we are most grateful. Viewers can watch the China Desk on YouTube or subscribe to hear all our interviews on Apple, Spotify, and most other podcast providers. We welcome you to check out our website and show archive at ChinaDeskPodcast.com. My guest today is Peter Mattis, president of the Jamestown Foundation. He returned to the foundation after serving as editor of China Brief from 2011 to 13 and as a fellow in the China program from 2013 to 2018. He previously served as senior fellow with the U.S. House Select Committee on Strategic Competition between the United States and the Chinese Communist Party on loan from the Special Competitive Studies Project, where he served as Director for Intelligence, as well as serving as the Senate-appointed staff director of the Congressional Executive China Commission. During his time on the CECC, he helped pass the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act, Tibetan Policy and Support Act, and the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. Peter's public service began as a counterintelligence analyst at the CIA. He is the author of Analyzing the Chinese Military, a review, essay, and resource guide on the People's Liberation Army, and co-author of Chinese Communist Espionage, an intelligence primer. Well, Peter, welcome to the China Desk. Let's jump in.
Thank you for having me, Steve. It's good to see you.
Well, I've been looking forward to this conversation for some time, and I gave you a little bit of warning in advance, as I try to be courteous to our guests, that we like to talk a little bit about who you are before we get into what's inside your mind. So, Peter, when you were in third grade and your teacher said, "What do you want to do when you grow up?" did you say, "I want to be an expert on Chinese intelligence"?
I definitely don't think I was considering that in third grade. I probably thought about being maybe a history teacher or, something along those lines. The idea of, working in Washington, D.C. or working for the federal government, those were things that were sort of like these lofty, dreams or images way out there that, maybe didn't seem possible from sort of small town southeastern Washington.
Were there things that you were getting into that you thought were going to drive your life in another way? Were you trying to be a firefighter, or you working on being an accountant, or you got pulled in another direction?
Look, I think there were a couple of things that shaped my interest in world affairs kind of from a younger age. I think it was about 7 during the Beijing Spring and the Tiananmen protests in 1989. So that's maybe that year is the first year that I remember having any sort of political memories or awareness of what was going on in the world, right? You have these Chinese students, Beijing workers out on the streets, right? It's being broadcast and everyone is getting some view of what is taking place in Beijing. Then you have the crackdown and the protests. Later that year you have the fall of the Berlin Wall and protests across sort of the Warsaw Pact countries. So that was that was the beginning of an awareness. And I would say the Persian Gulf War cemented it because I had a family member who was one of the first units there in Desert Shield from August of 1990. And that was right, like when your family members are there, when it's present, like all of a sudden it becomes a bit more real.
Yeah.
And I realized that I'd kind of gotten off the world affairs path when I was at university, but when I took my sort of 201, 202 intro to international relations, and sitting in the course and sitting in the section that I had with just a really excellent PhD student there who had experience in the Army at the National Bureau of Asian Research. I came out of the classes going like, this feels like home.
Mm-hmm. Well, so in the academic journey, you sort of teased a little bit of how you got pulled back into world affairs, things international. Was there a particular point that pulled you specifically in the direction of learning about and understanding China?
If there was kind of a sequence of events that sort of bounced things around. The first little contingency in my history was that the year that I arrived at my high school was the year they cut Japanese.
Uh-huh.
So I had to study something else and studied a couple of years of German. And I was looking for something else. And a couple of my good friends, as I was headed off to University of Washington, were suggesting, well, you should study Chinese, go down that road. They were from Hong Kong, they were from Shanghai. For the small Chinese families that were in my town, they all seemed to have kids that were about my age, and there was kind of a little bit of encouragement, like, "Oh, you should consider this."
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, "What the heck?" Signed up for it, and uh, I had a really phenomenal teacher. Right? She was disciplined. She was tough. She demanded you came prepared. Um, she said, you can open your textbook when I open it. Little realizing that she actually had the entire thing memorized as one of the authors.
That's a good one.
and but there were I think 11 of us that stayed with her the entire year and we didn't dare sign up for Chinese class at anything other than 8:30 in the morning, because that was the kind of, like, I wouldn't say it was some combination of loyalty, respect, and appreciation for the intensity that she brought to it and what she expected, right? And she never talked down to us. She never over exaggerated things for effect. She talked to us at speed,
Mm-hmm.
right? So you can imagine what it is as a freshman student when you're you're being told to repeat the whole question back because you can't just say, shoulda, busha kind of thing. And she goes, "你是不是你爸爸妈妈的好孩子?" And, like, that's the speed she taught at.
Mm-hmm.
And it meant that you just were much more prepared to deal with the world and go out into it. And um, it's kind of from there that, like, it started with the language and then realizing how many different things are kind of embedded in it,
Yeah.
right? The Chengyu, the symbolism in some of the characters, because we had to learn traditional to start,
Yep.
uh, right? Like those things draw you in,
Yeah.
right? It is one of the world's great civilizations that has this rich character of literature, of music, of history that runs through, and it's enchanting, it's enticing, it's
Yeah. Well, it's kind of funny. I mean, we've talked off and on for a number of years, and hear you talk about this story. It's kind of funny because I have some echoes a few years before, but I also was sort of an accidental move from maybe Japanese, but what the heck, let's try Chinese. And then had a really good teacher, and for reasons I couldn't explain, the Chinese language came along better than I expected and better than my study of Latin-based languages. For whatever reason, were very hard for my brain to assign gender to inanimate objects, but Chinese seemed straightforward. And that the language study was a gateway into much deeper thoughts about culture, history, government, politics, all the other things. That it's kind of funny that you can have this whimsical, well, Japanese isn't available, or I'm not going to take that class. Let's just switch here, and then a whole lifetime emerges in that at that fork in the road. So, congratulations to you for being another one of the fellow travelers. One of the best parts of doing the China Desk podcast is finding how many other people actually had some similar kind of origin story on this, and it's surprising how many. But that's
well, one of the funny ones is my professor at University of Washington on Japanese history, Ken Pyle, was
yeah,
someone who ended up in Japanese history rather than Chinese history because he thought a bird in the hand was better than two in the bush, and he was given his scholarship to study Japanese language for a couple of years before he got word about his Chinese one, and he had to make his decision. So he just said, "I'm not going to, like, maybe I've got a preference for the Chinese one, but I've got the Japanese one in hand. I need to make a decision, so I'll
yeah,
take that." And you know, probably 60 years later, he is still a relevant thinker and producing thoughtful works for helping us understand Japan's foreign policy, how their leaders see their place in the world.
yep. And it's but for another decision. Well, before we go from the origin story and start talking about some of the policy issues that I know are of interest to both of us and to the audience, Talk a little bit about the Jamestown Foundation. You got a cool banner behind you. And I know a little bit about Jamestown from my own think tank interactions over decades now. But talk a little bit about Jamestown and the China program within that.
Important thing to remember is that Jamestown Foundation is, at this point, about 43 years old, 42 years old. And this is kind of its third iteration because it's the previous two presidents have both served about 20 years. So hopefully I've got 18 ahead. I'll celebrate 2 years in a week. Um, but it began as, in some sense, kind of like a speaker's bureau, a life coach, a literary agent, an editor for a group of Soviet defectors that were coming over and or Soviet bloc defectors and helping them tell their stories, right? Because you know this part, Steve, right? Like when the intelligence community and the State Department and the Defense Department are debriefing defectors and having time with them, right? It's very focused on operational, practical, immediate
Right.
kinds of things. But you can't have grown up in that system and risen high in that system without having a huge amount of contextual knowledge that you just don't have, coming from the outside of it. And so it was, well, they've got other things that they can say. And so, how do we draw out that knowledge? How do we explain more of what we're dealing with in the Cold War to the American people? How do we amplify this direct firsthand knowledge of what is taking place? So the very first Jamestown products are the sort of acting Romanian intelligence chief Ion Pachiba's Red Horizons, and Arkady Shevchenko, the Undersecretary General at the UN for Political Affairs, um, book Breaking with Moscow, and that was the beginning. And it was a small group of businessmen, with kind of a Chicago connection that pulled this together and saw a sense of like, we need to tell this story, we need to help, bring it to the forefront and help Americans understand. And it's also the beginning of what I would say we are we are an organization that endeavors to provide the best information possible. And we're not about policy recommendations, but we're also not neutral, right? We're very firmly on the side of the United States, our allies, and have a particular aversion to communist or communistic regimes. And this is a mission that kind of went away after the Cold War, and there's a lot of scrambling around. But Jamestown opened a little office in Moscow and was sort of wiring back reports. It had some direct connections to some of the Chechens during the wars in the 1990s. And so there was information coming out and made available in the United States that was found nowhere else because of that connection. And then sort of gradually moved into this place where we had, our main publications, Terrorism Monitor, Eurasia Daily Monitor, China Brief, telling, giving analysis of our adversaries, frankly, and sometimes of our allies, in their own words and in their own terms, right? Like not trying to sit here and cite, oh, here's the New York Times. Like you can go through, I mean, how many think tank discussions have you been in, Steve, where you can pretty much say, I know exactly which article you read from which date, based on what was said, right? Much rarer is this like, well, that was Xinhua September 24th, 2023 that you read,
Correct.
right? And that's what Jamestown is really about, and trying to help us understand what are they doing? Why are they doing it? So that we're not mirror imaging, we're not inventing things. And this is a place where we've gotten a lot of calls right because we have a global network of analysts that have a good feel for who we're dealing with. Um, we've produced some really good people that have been the editors, like just in the China field, right? You had Russell Xiao, who was the China Brief editor, who went on to run the Global Taiwan Institute and is now at the CCP Select Committee. John Dotson's sort of running GTI now. You have some senior defense analysts at RAND. You have people at the SFRC staff, right? Like good people come out of this. And I think it's because when you're editing a publication and you're having to write yourself, it gives you a wider aperture on what's taking place. And that's really where I think we've got value. And, my little twist on this right now is taking some of the people that are motivated, are educated, and for whatever reason have to be in exile or choosing to live in the United States, and how do we take that knowledge that they have and bring it to the inside of the countries that they cover, and like how do we have them on staff so that we, if someone wants a briefing, it's not just me or it's not just someone else who can do it, but we have one of the world's experts in Cheryl Yu, who has identified, I would say at this point, more than like 4,500 United Front organizations.
That's a pretty substantial investment to a quality conversation in DC. And I can say, at least in my personal experience, I came into contact with China Brief back in the 1990s when I was at Heritage for the first time. And I've seen some of the evolution of things, of people and product out of Jamestown. So I hope one of the added benefits of our episode is that people know that this is out there, the work that you and your colleagues are doing today, and will kind of think on it, read on it, and maybe they can also contribute to some of the quality of the analysis and products that are going through. And if they are so inclined, they might consider supporting it too. There's no harm in that. But so we've got who Peter Mattis is. That was a conversation, really. We could have made the entire episode because Peter Mattis is an international man of mystery that is of great interest to me and to the audience, I'm sure. But also we've done our bit on Jamestown. But I know that there are a series of policy areas that you've given a lot of thought on and that your colleagues have done some work on too that I really want to draw out. But sort of our segue into that is when I think of you and I think of Jamestown, I think about trying to get the frame of how to think about the strategic intentions of the Chinese Communist Party right. That's almost like the sweet spot of what the work is. You can correct or revise and extend if I am shoving too many words in your mouth on that front. But the question for you is, you've got a somewhat interesting, maybe unique combo of experiences before coming into this, of having been in intelligence, congressional oversight, and think tank work over the years. How have those different vantage points added value to how you personally try to assess the strategic intentions of the CCP?
I think where I stumbled across something, in high school playing soccer, where I went from zero to being, an all conference player over time of sort of thinking, teaching, and doing. And it was those combination of that I really had accidentally stumbled on. I studied film. I watched players. I wanted to see how the best in the world played my position. So I probably watched a game a week, throughout high school as kind of an average. Maybe the same game, more than a few times because I didn't have a lot of options. But saw that, studied it, thought about it, did some reading. But then I was also coaching, right? How do I teach someone else to do some of these things? And then I played a lot. One of my friends and I grabbed our club team's balls and were custodians of them in the off season, and we were out 3, 4, 5 times a week, kicking around, right? And it's kind of a holy trinity of expertise, I think, because you can be dealing with the exact same things, but you're coming at it from such different directions that your brain has to deal with it in different ways. And I stumbled across that more deliberately, but still a little bit of stumbling at the agency
Mm-hmm.
and thinking through those pieces where I was working with a lot of different people and not necessarily supporting a traditional policy customer, that forced me to think about the same information in different ways to help it, be useful, because somebody in your position at the NSC, needed one thing, but someone who was a case officer out somewhere in the world dealing with something, like, needed something completely different, right? But even though the core of it was the same information.
Yeah.
And I think that's what I've gotten out of these different experiences, is learning a bit more about, that really the crux of intelligence work, the crux of think tank work, is about helping people make better decisions. And therefore there's an element of this that just doesn't scale. It can't be You can't take the human element out of it. You have to deal with it in a face-to-face way of like, okay, well, what are you really getting at? Okay, here's how I can help you.
Hmm.
Okay, I can help plug this gap, or I can fill this in. Um, and that's, I think, the most important thing of recognizing that these different experiences help you see the variety of decision makers and the variety of things that are under consideration, um, to help people understand it. And I'm struck by one of the really great young people that I work with, Sunny Jung, who was one of the Hong Kong student leaders.
Good friend.
He commented that one of his experiences in grad school in the US made him sort of rethink his time as an activist, during the student protest movements, and realizing just how big the world was to US policymakers, right? And how small it seemed that what they were talking about from Hong Kong appeared. And he sort of wished that that experience was there in the past, and preparing him for him. And I think that that's kind of where I'm at. Like, these experiences have given me different tools to support different kinds of decisions, to help people package things in different ways, and to realize that you can't scale some of this, right? It's not just a young professionals program where you cultivate 20 people at a time, or and kind of move it en masse, but that there is an element of sort of deliberate cultivation of individuals that needs to be done,
Hmm.
that is not this kind of professional society, or a large group thing, but how are we generating talent that is able to perform at this high level?
Yeah. I think that's an extraordinary nugget of wisdom, real wisdom. And I think it's a very, very underappreciated, maybe even unknown quality in things Washington. And I was the personal beneficiary of some of that too at different stages. And when you're on the receiving end, you might not even be cognizant of it. But I think you're exactly right about the need to have personal cultivation of individuals and talents that you find, and allowing those talents to get this varied angles of vision into their experience so that they can then have a more mature and informed way of articulating what needs to be shared at the right time and moment of opportunity. I mean, that's, I think, my experience in the White House and in other places is that you grow up in academia or a think tank or being seen as an expert. You think, well, the main thing is I acquire knowledge and the world will come to me for that knowledge. But the missing part is that knowledge really is of very minimal value unless it is getting in useful and digestible form to people who truly need it to change the direction the world is going at the right time. And that, having those varied experiences, increasing your odds of being able to do exactly that is vital.
I think this gets also back to your question about intentionality, and understanding the CCP's intentions, because it's very easy to say, well, why do we need to know that? Intentions can change, as we were all taught in IR. It's capabilities that matter, not intentions, because they're too fungible and they're too amorphous to understand anyways. But I think one of the interesting things that I realized a few years ago when I was living outside of DC is that I wasn't learning very much when I came into DC. I was almost in more of an educational mode of, okay, here's what you need to understand, here's how to explain it. And it was only when I went to a couple of places where there was a small concentration of people that were really had their heads in the right place, were thinking about things in a forward-looking direction, in Prague, in Canberra, where I got productive thinking done, because it wasn't an educational point. We were already at this kind of level of understanding, and now we could just riff. We could play together intellectually, so to speak. And in DC, it was, how do we constantly bring people up? And the intentions piece is the why. Like, why is the party doing things, right? Think about the things in your career
Yeah.
that you've encountered when it's like Beijing is doing this, and people are like, well, why would they do that? That seems insane. Or, of course, they wouldn't do that. A normal country wouldn't do those things,
Yep.
right? And just as an example, because it's in my mind today, because people are a little bit shocked about the news coming out of New York City, that the New York Times reported on, that you have somebody who was involved in Chinese organized crime, who's now involved with the party and involved with kind of political machine building to influence politics there. Like, we tend not to think of the CCP being involved in criminality, and yet the CCP has been involved in criminality since the very beginning. I mean, the irony of them complaining about these years of suppression by the West, of the century of humiliations, is that the CCP was selling opium from Yan'an to fund itself.
Yeah.
And they were not selling it to Afghans or to Russians or to Americans or British. They were selling it to Chinese people, right? So, when people have been told, there is something where they're involved in pushing fentanyl precursors, or they're involved in producing methamphetamine, right? They're providing value-added tax rebates for it, right? There's this like, well, no, they wouldn't be involved in such criminality. Like, but why would they treat Americans, why would they treat Mexicans or Canadians any better than they've treated their own people?
Yeah. No, that's a very, very core observation. That in my experience, it's very difficult to get to sort of an acceptance point among an analyst until they've actually experienced it. But if you've had any consequential period of interaction, you will undoubtedly experience something that is an absolute bullseye experience that you just described, probably more than once. And it's just so important to getting your vision and your assessment of that intentionality right. So I think that's a really, really important part of the conversation. Now, I do want to move a little bit into some of the things you have written. You were co-author of Chinese Communist Espionage, the intelligence primer. Now, a lot of people, in sort of my generation of coming into the intelligence community and China analysis, were at the end of the Cold War, and there were a lot of Sovietologists. The Cold War allegedly ends. I argue, I may be counter-historical in some people's view, I argue the Cold War didn't actually end. It ended in our mind, but the Cold War didn't end. But I was in the minority then, and maybe even now to a certain degree. But I was in one of the intelligence services that was absolutely showered with Sovietologists cross-training into China, because one was a communist party and the other is a communist party, and we don't want to give up all of this expertise and analysis capability that we paid so much for, and so we'll just cross train these people over into China, and off we go from the 90s into the 2000s. So, leaving aside the business merits of that move, you've been in somewhat of a unique point of view to be able to help educate people on what do you see as sort of the difference between what people thought of as kind of Soviet Cold War intelligence versus what we live with now in CCP intelligence operations.
I think one of the differences between sort of where China's intelligence services, or the CCP's intelligence services, have come up is that they went through this period of intense, high risk operations in the context of a civil war and revolution. And that meant that they actually ended up missing out on big capabilities that were there.
Mm-hmm.
And the the biggest one is that in the 20s and 30s is the shift from when codes went from being human made to being machine made, right? And you couldn't break machine codes by hand. You had to have another machine to help you. And of course, those things were incredibly sensitive, and no one was prepared to share them, right? So even though Mao Zedong and other CCP leaders referred to the what was the Central Revolutionary Military Committee's Second Bureau as the lantern that lights the night road to guide them through the long march, and it was mostly in terms of signals intelligence. It was largely based on document exploitation, right? They would go out on raids. They had people who knew what to look for in terms of code books and headquarters. They would take them from the KMT, and then they would use that until the codes changed. And so they continued kind of going down that road, but they could never develop the technological capacity, right? The Cold War opens up. The Soviets aren't sharing that with anyone else. We're obviously not sharing it with them. And so they go through this period of kind of darkness where they're not involved in the global Cold War kind of intelligence battle, where, to just to pick a famous example, because it's one that we can talk about, right? That ambassadorial seal that was given to Averell Harriman that has the little rod inside to rotate, and it was like putting in microwaves into the building. They reverberate and come back with the voice carried with it, right? The Soviets didn't share that with any of their partners. And I think the British and the US intelligence services turned around within 6 to 9 months and started applying that worldwide, right? And so it was a battle where we all got better with each other. And in some sense, like in that world, like the CIA and KGB grew up with each other,
Mhm.
right? We all learned off of each other and got better. And the CCP was never a part of that. So I think when they come out onto the world stage in the 1980s, right, they've had three major purges of their intelligence services under Mao with the Cultural Revolution, getting rid of Kongshan's legacy of abusing the intelligence services the way that, Laurenti Beria abused the OGPU and NKVD against Stalin's political opponents, right? So they have to learn how to operate on the world. And so they're actually coming of age at a very different time with very different connectivity. And this is why, they probably saw the value and the promise of cyber in the 1990s before others and invested in this kind of weird hybrid state and private ecosystem of, what we're now facing today, where they have a market for offensive cyber tools. They have a market for defensive cyber tools. And it's something where you see crossover and incentives from the state and private enterprise that creates things that may actually or may actually now be, in terms of world leaders, having the right ecosystem where if they're not in the lead today, in like 5 to 10 years, without some sort of change in the way that we think about things, they could be the best in the world at this.
Well, there's an internationalization of these things that has occurred uh, over multiple decades, but I think our awareness of it in the United States has dramatically accelerated in the last 10 years. And that is what is broadly under the topic of United Front. You mentioned your colleague who is a walking legend in trying to research and articulate what is the United Front. But I think it would really benefit from you to sort of defining some terms that help us understand what, when we see news stories pop up about New York or a really odd lab in California or some people trying to smuggle a fungus into Michigan or other kinds of things. There's something going on, but it's pretty hard for a lot of Americans, even educated professional Americans, to try to fill in some coherence about who is doing what and why in all of this. And the closest thing to holding some of those pieces together to understand them and deal with it, I think, is the United Front. So you can correct whether my lead-in is right or wrong, but help define and give our audience some understanding about how this is playing out in our news today and what policymakers really need to understand about how to deal with it.
So I think the most important thing is to understand that United Front we can look at it in different ways, right? We can see it as kind of a theory of politics that you win by mobilizing your friends, by isolating your enemies or converting them, and converting neutrals to your cause, right? And it is fundamentally a tool of struggle, right? Mao described it as one of the three magic weapons for winning the revolution that is alongside armed struggle, party building, and united front. And you can say, well, like that's Mao's China. This one is different. Xi Jinping is different, right? It's like, well, every leader between Mao and Xi has endorsed it, has endorsed the framework, has invested varying degrees of sort of policy change to adapt to new circumstances to it. And it still is, as Mao said, we build the party to be the warrior that wields the twin weapons of united front and armed struggle to break and shatter the enemy, right? So there is, in fact, like no good engagement with them, right? Like if this is how you're choosing to engage, China, kind of like in the broadest, almost civilizational sense, like this is not a route in. This is actually there to block you from having that meaningful engagement or impact or exchange that you're looking for. So you have to be creative about getting around it. So it's that philosophy of politics. It's that it's also a tool of struggle. And it's worth noting that if you think about the three biggest Xi Jinping policy initiatives when he came in as general secretary, right? You have reform of the party to prepare it for struggle, as he put it, the 20-party Congress. You have the big reform of the PLA organization, this organizational overhaul, and then less well known is the organizational overhaul of the United Front system that was started in 2015, and the first actually central kind of committee meeting on United Front work since his father had chaired it in 1986 or 87. So, you can see that these three things sort of strike a chord in his memory. And in his centenary speech in July 2021, he talked about three things, right? Reform of the party, reform of the PLA, and the United Front system, right? So it's still a key concept and a view of how, like, it's almost a way of power, right? If we think about the dime or dime filled version of strategy, right? The Chinese version of this has a U in it for United Front. And so it's this philosophy. The second thing that a it is organization. And most of the time people say the United Front Work Department. Well, it's like, well, which one? Right? There's a central committee one. There's 31 provincial ones. There's a China Academy of Sciences United Front Work Department. Some of the foreign businesses in China that have party committees inside them actually do have a fully formed United Front Work Department attached to their committee. So you could have, Acme USA United Front Work Department, right? It is a large organizational apparatus, and it's a policy system that other ministries plug into. Ministry of Foreign Affairs has its part. The Ministry of State Security has its part. Ministry of Education and Hanban and Confucius Institute are that part of it, right? Ministry of Commerce has a part of it, right? Every single one is there. And why this matters, in a sense, is that it creates a political tool that can be mobilized by the system for different things. So it can be done for economic espionage. It can be done for um, technology transfer, right? People who sort of know the secret handshake and know what's there know that if they're tasked to go out with something or to find something or to get access to something, that they can tap this network and find some support and get what they want back. It also means that it facilitates, like since you mentioned the Reedley Lab in California,
Yeah.
right? It facilitates criminals,
Yeah.
like criminals and hucksters who, if they know the secret handshake, and they can go persuade people like, oh no, help me out, when all they're really trying to do is make a buck or two for their
Hmm.
own personal enrichment, right? And again, I think this gets back to that CCP and criminality and what they're comfortable with. It's also there for political influence. It's also there for surveillance, control, and monitoring of diaspora communities and others that are sort of consequence, right? So we tend to think of it in this kind of operational or in this tactical sense, but it's really about creating a political tool that the party can leverage for whatever its needs are at a given moment, or whatever other aspects of the system need to pull on it to
Hmm.
get done what they need to get done.
Well, it's a lot for people to digest, but I think it's extraordinarily important, and you've put it among the best I've ever heard in terms of the history, consistency over decades, and how it's really, I think, it being employed in real time before our eyes now. So hopefully, your articulation of this helps people have a little bit more of a cohesive understanding of why the CCP would have this kind of tool and network, why certain things might be happening by way of this network. And I also thought you gave a very, very important warning that too many people mistakenly think this is their access point to be able to reach points of influence inside of China or to get access to meaningful information, whether it's the long-term missionary impulse or the long-term commercial impulse. There are a lot of people that think and want to be reaching the Chinese people and civilization for the long term, but they are going through a gateway that is this united front that is inherently built, as you said, to block that and maybe push things back through these willing people in the reverse direction. So all of that's been going on for a long time. I think too many of our experts either haven't studied it, haven't appreciated, or they just thought it didn't matter as much. But I think we're really seeing the confluence of technology, power and leverage. Globalization really enabled a lot of these tools to spread. And so I think we're at sort of a critical juncture on this. We're going to run short on time in this episode, Peter, and I'd love to have you back another time because there's several sort of chapters of things that I would love to talk with you about and for the audience to be able to hear. But before we take a zoom out, I'd love to take a zoom in for a segment about Taiwan. Because in my growth and development as an analyst and studying things classical Chinese, I was sent to what I was told was the real China, where I studied real characters and real history and all of that stuff in the 1980s. They said, but what I ended up learning about was an island that I found to be very different from China I would come to understand. But my experience aside, that is the place in the world where I witnessed and learned the most about what the United Front is and how it deploys things, because, at least in my estimation, it is per capita the most attacked geography on the planet by the United Front, and in every way, shape, or form. But talk for a few minutes about the experiences you've had, especially recently, in going to Taiwan and assessing things in Taiwan and dealing with friends in Washington who have kind of acid test questions about, is Taiwan ready to defend itself? Is it doing enough? Is it a place that we could afford to lose and still hold alliances? There's a lot of questions circulating in Washington that are at the center of this. But this united front, but then what's the reality you're seeing about a society and a government surviving because constant united front attack? What are some of the key takeaways you've had of recent times?
Well, first, I'm just thinking about small pieces of influence. I think you and I have actually talked more face to face in Taiwan than we have in
It's
the
kind of
United
funny, but
States.
true.
I remember a long, long nighttime conversation near Xiaonanmen, um,
That's right.
perhaps the first time we met about a decade ago. It's a, it is an interesting place in part because I had that same view or was told that same view of a real China. And it's very clear that it was something else before it was sort of loosely subjected to Qing control. It was subjected to Japanese colonialism, and something came out on the other side. The KMT ruled for 30 odd years of really brutal military dictatorship and martial law, and something came out on the other side, right? So there really is something about Taiwan as Taiwan that should be understood. It's not, we can joke about, whether or not we should call, mainland China, a mainland or, West Taipei to be offensive to the Chinese Taipei kind of Olympic thing. But it's clear that there is something there that is distinctly Taiwanese, and it's worth remembering that, right? This is a group of people that have built something that is uniquely theirs, right? And when people come out of that experience, right? Whether they are Americans who were formerly British colonists or Scots or Irish, like there is something unique that comes out of it and a different mentality. And I think it's one of those things where we ought to remember that is the case. So if we're wondering whether or not people will fight, right? People want to defend that.
Mhm.
They saw what happened in Hong Kong, what it meant to have one country, two systems, right? There people want to say, sort of take the line that, oh, Chinese people won't hit Chinese people, as the CCP says, 中国人不打中国人, right? But if you look at the CCP's history, it's basically who the CCP knows how to fight,
Yeah.
is other Chinese people. So I think that we have something there that is that is unique, and you can't just subsume it in saying, oh, if I understand China, I understand Taiwan, or vice versa. Second piece of this that I think is really important is we know from the PRC's experience what the consequences are of opposing the CCP, right? That if you are rejecting the view of CCP citizenship, or of the, to kind of play on the old Soviet way of like the new Chinese man, so to speak, like there is very clearly a mold that is expected that the party has of what it means to be Chinese. And if you reject that because you're Uyghur or Tibetan or Mongolian, but let's also face it, like we've had language riots in Guangdong province, right? We had a brutal, brutal suppression of Sichuan, from 1949 to 1951, where hundreds of thousands of people were killed, right? Like this is the consequence of opposing the CCP, right? There is no sort of like, oh, they could take over and, it might be different, but it would be fine. Maybe it's not as bad as KMT martial law. Um, right? That's just not what the experience is. And that's not the experience of opposing the CCP up to that point. So the consequences are there, are quite severe. And I think that a lot of Taiwanese people understand that. But to get to those kind of acid test questions from DC of like, what's going on there? How do we think about it? One of the things that's just been really troubling to me, and I've had 4 trips to Taiwan in the last 18 months, um, and people from Jamestown have been in Taiwan for a total of about 10 weeks this year in different trips, is that if we want Taiwan to step up to defend itself, to prepare, we have to stop undermining our own objectives, right? In a democratic society, the people follow leadership. And if a Taiwanese president talks about national security, we slap them down. We say it's symbolic. Why would you do this? Right? A president has to be able to mobilize their people, right? Like it's just the way that works, right? If the president won't come out and say it or can't come out and say it, then it's never going to be popular. It's never going to drive things, right? He'll never have the political capital to drive some of the issues of military reform that are sort of hangovers from things. Um, and second, or sort of a little corollary underneath this point is that we also need to understand the history of this. I've been a little bit shocked recently by how few people understand why the Taiwanese military is in the bad shape that it's in. And this has been a slow decline in some respects. But the Ma Ying-jeou administration broke the conscription system, created the worst form of hybrid conscription volunteer force that you could possibly imagine, and broke up the military prison system that was one of the few deterrents against CCP's United Front work and espionage targeting the military, right? And then you ended up with these civilian courts with this very weird sentencing system where incredibly damaging things got punished with minimal punishment, and people continue to commit espionage from prison because now their meetings with people were no longer recorded, right? So it was a terrible system. And the KMT is controlling the legislature. And I think, we've heard a lot of talk from them about how, they need to be respectful and responsible stewards of taxpayer dollars. And they need to think about some of these things, in a sophisticated way about which weapons to purchase and how to go down this road. But as you know, from dealing with the congressional side from the opposite end, right, we could come up with any number of questions about what does it mean to be responsible
Right.
and as excuses for not supporting you. And I think that one of those ways that we can support ourselves in getting Taiwan prepared and pushing them in a positive direction is to tell the KMT, this is the capability we expect you to be able to field, right? We expect the Taiwanese military to be able to do this and to do this and to do this. You figure out the rest of the way there, but you've got to figure it out and you've got to get there. Because, by the way, guys, you broke it.
Yeah.
So you have a responsibility to help in fixing.
Yeah, those are very, very core points that I almost never hear in DC conversations about these subjects, even among people who are 3, 4, in some cases 5-decade-long identified experts on this policy area. And yet there is this very visceral reality. For me, it comes back to kind of the beginning of our conversation. We were talking about the importance of different experiences and angles of vision that have to inform how you think, assess, and communicate what you are trying to do. And for people that have no real life experience in going out and getting votes, going out and raising funds for political campaigns, going out and having to manage, ride herd, the stray cats of a political party, can't have any idea what the challenge is for a party leader in Taiwan or elsewhere for that matter, and to have that very real calculus that anyone involved in free and open and competitive politics has to know. You can't escape those organizational principles any more than you can escape trying to understand the People's Republic of China with no firsthand experience dealing with the Communist Party of China. And so that real visceral part of the system has been absent from American policymaking towards Taiwan since before the democratic revolution in Taiwan, but it's been painful to me to see it absent almost through to the present. So I appreciate that you've sort of opened up the conversation about the angles of vision. I think, I don't know whether I'm crazy on this front, maybe I see this everywhere, but I think that some of the frames that we're educating the audience about how to understand things on China actually help if you build up some similar disciplines in trying to understand things in Taiwan. And ultimately, if we want to have a sustainable policy, it's got to be built on rock, not sand. It's got to be on truth and real understanding of what we're working with. So I hope there will be among our audience some people who are informing the informers inside the administration and elsewhere to get some of these nuggets to work with. But Peter, I want to thank you for your time and insight with us on this episode. Before we close out, where can people go to follow your commentary and the good work of Jamestown?
I mean, the first is our website, jamestown.org. If you want to get the full fire hose of what Jamestown is producing, sign up for the Substack. You'll get Eurasia, you'll get terrorism, you'll get China Brief, and that's really our main dissemination mechanism. Sign up for the subscription to have them delivered to your inbox, email. That's really the main place. And I've been dabbling my heels to escape administration in writing an analysis that we did as a major group effort of our team here of Xi Jinping's power, trying to understand the sort of the state of play given all the rumors that were floating around. So that's really where you'll find me. It's where you'll find others, and I think it's a great place because as one of as a State Department official told us that China Brief is something like a primary source document because even if we disagree with the analysis, like we're still going to learn things about facts that we can't dispute or policies that came out. And that to me is what Jamestown is about. And it's really what I consider my career and what I've dedicated myself to of like, how do we make better decisions, more informed decisions? Because there's no excuse for ignorance when the stakes are as high as they are.
Well, I think we are at our point where we say goodbye. I want to ask our audience if you have enjoyed today's China Desk conversation, please tell your friends and consider subscribing. and give a visit to ChinaDeskPodcast.com. Thank you all for joining. A special thank you to Peter Mattis for sharing his perspective. Until next time, I'm Steve Yates, your host here at the China Desk.
Thank you for listening to the China Desk Podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire and hosted by Steve Yates. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.